Welcome back, and thank you for joining us on An Unexpected Bite. Today we have a very special guest, one of my dear friends, Stephanie. I met her through the military. Both of our husbands were active duty in the Little Rock Air Force Base, and she is younger than me, but one of my role models nonetheless. She has a drive that is unmatched, and she tackles anything that is thrown at her. She has a bachelor's degree in early childhood education, and for the past 12 years, Stephanie has juggled military life, raising her children, her professional life as a teacher, and now medical coder, all while continuing to care for her family back home in Texas. In 2022, Stephanie and her family moved to Nellis Air Force Base, where they currently reside, which is in Las Vegas, if y'all are wondering. And while settling into this life, Stephanie took a fresh start to work on herself a little bit more, and she started writing a book, but she's still juggling a family, career, and challenges from military life. But her debut book, Ketchup Sandwiches, was released a few weeks ago, and we can't wait to hear about it.
Stephanie, I'm so excited. Can you please tell us a little about Ketchup Sandwiches and what inspired you to write this book?
Yes. So Ketchup Sandwiches is a memoir. And one of the biggest things that inspired me to write this book is I volunteer with young people. And I love giving back and being able to work with young people. But one of the biggest things I hear from people who've been through traumatic experiences and are struggling with repeating cycles and making some bad decisions is, well, you just don't understand. You don't know where I'm coming from. You don't know what I've been through. And to which I always say, you're absolutely right, because everyone's experiences are unique, right? But I have been through traumatic experiences, and I wanted to tell my story in a way that would provide hope. And that wouldn't just be me pouring out my trauma and saying, oh, look what I went through, but showing how I healed. And so it took a while to figure out how to tell the story in a way that was going to provide hope and healing. But that was, unfortunately, I didn't have the best childhood. My story is not unique. And by any means, there's too many children who suffer from abusive parents and who then have to deal with the lifelong effects of childhood trauma and what it does to the brain. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
So I'm sure all of you pediatric cancer families or providers who are listening today are like, how does this tie in? But we're going to talk about how trauma affects the brain. And while Stephanie's story is not about pediatric cancer, her story is, like she said, not unique. And there are a lot of things that are in common with families undergoing pediatric cancer and any kind of emotional or abuse.
Okay.
All right. So, I'm sure you guys are wondering what we are doing talking to someone about childhood trauma and someone that's lived through that. But I feel like as pediatric cancer families, we have all experienced trauma. And I think a lot of these things could be super helpful in sharing with our pediatric cancer families. So, Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about how trauma impacts the brain?
Absolutely. I always like to address this question first on a scientific level because there's so much that happens to a brain when it's undergoing what we call survival mode. The first of which is that you're flooded with cortisol and norepinephrine, which are kind of our stress hormones. And when these hormones are flooding our brain in a consistent time frame, somebody who's living in a hospital and wondering what's happening to their kid from minute to minute and if they're going to make it to tomorrow, you're constantly struggling with this life or death, fight or flight issue. So these hormones have an effect on your amygdala, which controls your emotions, your hippocampus, and that plays a major role in our memory. I don't know if you've known anybody who's gone through an experience and just been like, I know it just happened, but I can't remember. Well, those stress hormones affect your ability to form new memories sometimes and to create recall. And then our prefrontal cortex, wow, which is going to be like your executive functionings, and that's anytime somebody who's had what we call TBI, traumatic brain injury, and it affects their prefrontal cortex, you're going to notice that those people are going to be a little bit more volatile because they don't have that executive functioning. It's your planning, your ability to make decisions, your working memory. your personality, your behavior, speech and language, impulse control, emotion regulation, self-awareness. All of these things get affected. And I'm not talking about just like a singular traumatic event. This is when you go through something that's prolonged and your brain is constantly being soaked in these hormones. When our brains are young, especially, and that consistent flow of cortisol and norepinephrine, it hinders the actual development. And there are MRIs and scans that you can look at that show the effects that these hormones have on these parts of our brains. As far as like personally, I know when I was, especially when I was first coming out, when I was in the 6th grade, my aunt and uncle took my sisters and I in. And I was really at the beginning of my healing process and had not even begun to tap into all of the trauma that I'd been through. I would have extreme outbursts at school, which is, as a 6th grader, is not like socially acceptable. And so, it caused a lot of social problems amongst my peers. Teachers would get frustrated easily, and there would be times where it would come out in anger and I got suspended for fighting. I'm not a particularly violent person, but I got, pushed to a point, and I had been learning that I could stand up for myself, and I fought back and I got suspended. And then there were multiple times where I got kicked out of class for crying, and I couldn't explain why I was crying. It's that emotional regulation. So,
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. How can families how can recognizing triggers of what you're just talking about help families cope?
triggers are a big way that we understand the trauma itself. And so, in my opinion, the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that whatever you've gone through is trauma. Because we, as a society, we just have this tendency to kind of brush things aside and go, oh, yeah, that was horrible, but it's over now. But is it? A lot of people don't really understand what PTSD is, and that it's not just something that happens to war veterans. It's not just something that happens to somebody who's been in a horrific accident. It's something that happens to somebody who's experienced these prolonged traumatic events. And so understanding that, to do that, I want to explain the definition that's most widely accepted for trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that can have a profound physical and emotional impact on a person. And this can be caused by a singular event, but more often it's caused by these prolonged events. I know Tiffany has shared some of her therapy stuff that she's been through with her PTSD from Nora and being in the hospital. And I can't relate to that specifically, but I've had my own moments. But understanding these triggers, once you know what the trigger is, you can start to unpack, okay, so this is what triggered me. How does that relate to my trauma? And how do I prevent that trigger? How do I mediate that moving forward? That makes sense.
No,
Yeah,
100%.
we actually just were talking on another podcast that'll be released after this one, but we were talking about the effects of trauma and how even though my trauma was very different than Kelly's, very different than yours, but it all has the same response and can elicit the same emotions and things in society that are not typically socially accepted. But, I've made it a mission of mine to make these things acceptable socially, or maybe not accepted, but at least more understood.
Definitely understood, because I think we as PTSD survivors or people that function with PTSD, maybe that's the better way to say it, is, there's not a cure pill. There's not one single therapy we can do. I still wake up, my husband, a couple nights ago, writing this book I had to dredge up all of these feelings again. And a couple nights ago still, he woke me up. He was like, Steph, get up, you're crying. It's okay, you're crying. And so I still have nightmares that evoke that. I'm not just crying in my dreams, I'm actually crying. And so and then, there are moments where you're in a grocery store and something happens or you see something and you have to ground yourself and work your way out of it, and can't explain it to somebody who's never been through it.
Right.
Kelly
Even
and I were
as
talking the other day, prepping for this podcast, about how before we both were like, oh, that's something that happens to people that were in the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. Even as a nurse, I didn't recognize that PTSD was so common in pediatric cancer families. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
week leading up to my daughter going back for scans, I find myself getting a lot of brain fog. When we step into the hospital, I look down and sometimes my hands are shaking, and I don't even realize that
Mm-hmm.
it's something that, you know, it's affecting families in so many different ways, and so many different people, not just, you know, people who've been to
And
wars,
that's
but you
not
feel like
something that
associated.
they talk to you about when you're getting that diagnosis.
Right.
And that's one of those things we're going to talk about later in our questions. But, you know, that information on the front side can do a lot, even in situations like that, where you're going, you know, hey, I just want you to know this is about to be the worst emotional roller coaster you're ever going to take.
Right.
And, you know, kind of giving people, this is what, just like we do postpartum, right? We tell
Right.
moms, hey, here's some things that you should look for postpartum depression. We should have a list for families that are going through cancer saying, hey, here's some things that you can look for as far as this is about to be a traumatic experience.
Mhm.
PTSD, here's some signs and symptoms for anxiety, things like that. So
what are some common symptoms of PTSD for parents and or children who have been in this survival mode?
definitely, there's a lot. And when we look at them individually, and I think that's why it's so hard for us as a society to say, oh, PTSD is common, because everybody looks at the individual symptoms, right? Instead of putting everything together and getting the bigger picture. And so, just to name a few, you know, reliving the events over and over in your head. And thinking, so not only are you reliving the events, but you keep going, okay, you're pinpointing places where you're like, I could have prevented, or I could have done, I could have done, I could have done. And that creates that negative cyclical thought pattern. And so, one of the things that happens in our brains that neuroscience is finally catching up with is our thought patterns can actually create these grooves. So, you know, in the neurons and synapses, the pathways that get used the most are the ones that get strengthened. And as we get older into our 20s, we begin neural pruning. And so the pathways that aren't getting used are getting pruned away. Once those neurons are gone, that's it. They don't regenerate, they don't grow. And so we're having to rework your thought patterns. It becomes a lot harder once we've kind of started to prune away. So when your immediate thought pattern is, my, like in y'all's example, you have other kids. My kid is sick, could be cancer. That's going to be where your thoughts go, because you spent the better part of whatever time with your other children going through these treatments, and now you see it. Now you have these thoughts. You know, with my kids, they go over to a friend's house, and with what happened to me, I mean, it happened by family members, but I think they're going to get hurt. They're going to get hurt, and I'm not going to protect them. And I have to tell myself, okay, first of all, we can't let my trauma hinder them living their lives. They have to live their lives. I have to trust that God has them and he's going to protect them. I've met these parents. You've been in their house. You know them. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And so I have these internal conversations to try to get rid of those cyclical thought patterns, nightmares, problems sleeping. I have a handful of nightmares that just recur. And like I said earlier, sometimes I wake up crying. Sometimes I wake up and I have to go check on my children. I have to open their doors and I have to go check on them. Becoming very upset when something causes those memories, those trigger events. So for me, for the longest time, the smell of like motor oil or gasoline, because my stepfather worked in a hydraulics facility manufacturing things, and he always smelled that way. And um, it would make me physically sick. And then when I would start to get physically sick, I would get so angry, and I would get angry and I would throw things or yell or just become to anybody around me. They'd be like, what the heck just happened? You know, or when somebody would say things, you know, being called kids are mean. being called names is not uncommon when you're in middle school. And so somebody saying something under their breath would set me off. And teachers would be like, okay, so what? They said you're stupid. You're not stupid. Just move on. And I'm like, I couldn't move on because it was a trauma response and I was having a PTSD moment, but didn't know that at the time. A lack of positive emotions, intense fear or ongoing sadness, unable to get out of that. Like, even though you're at a birthday party and everybody else is having a good time, you're sitting there, you're smiling, you're faking it, right? But inside you're just going, I don't want to be here.
Wow.
You can't feel the happiness. You don't feel the joy. So
Wow.
those are just a few.
I shared this with Tiffany when you're talking about smells. My daughter was only 10 months old when she was diagnosed, and she was in treatment until about a year and a half. And sometimes I think in my head, she's doing so well because she was little. She didn't really understand. But recently she smelled rubbing alcohol and she shouted, "Mom, that smells like cancer." And I was taken aback because she relates the smell of rubbing alcohol to being in the hospital, to accessing her IV, to as far as I'm aware, I didn't see her get upset about it. But thinking back now, I'm like, well, was she a little extra emotional after that? I don't know. I would have had to really pay, a little closer attention. But thank you for sharing that because, absolutely this is very relatable to even the smallest of kids, the older kids, the teenagers, really anybody that can affect.
Parents.
Yeah.
I imagine that, you guys are medical professionals, so the medical smells may not as much, but you think about the things that we do in our day-to-day lives and even sounds that can trigger things. I know sometimes when I hear somebody, if I don't see them come up behind me, but I hear somebody, I can feel my adrenaline start to pump and stuff. And I have to go, okay, Stephanie, you're in a grocery store. People walk behind you. That's just what people do in grocery stores. It's fine, So, but learning those triggers and then acknowledging, hey, what I went through was traumatic. I have PTSD. And then working through them. And we're going to kind of talk about some of the techniques here in a minute.
One thing I found interesting is being a nurse practitioner, even after Nora got sick and passed, I went back to work and I would go around at the hospital and I'd go in these hospital rooms and I'd talk to these patients and I was always fine and it didn't really affect me. But then I hurt my ankle, had to go to the ER because we thought it was broken. But sitting in the hospital bed, I just start sobbing uncontrollably. And the nurse is like, "Oh my God, do you need some pain medicine? Like, is it hurting that bad?" And I'm like, "No, you can't help me." I'm like hysterical because I'm like, and then Jeremy had to be like, our daughter just died a few months ago. And and the nurse was like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." And it was like this whole big
You were
thing.
on the other side
It was
of it.
something I wasn't expecting because I walk in hospital rooms every day.
Time.
Right.
And then all of a sudden but sitting in the hospital bed was very different.
Oh yeah.
Triggering.
Makes me want to give you a hug. So.
All right, Tiffany, I think the next question's yours, but I'm going to take it. Can you tell me a little bit about how important community support is in the healing process? So, like in your experience, what are some effective strategies for healthcare providers to support emotional healing in their patients and in their families?
We've been kind of touching on this all along, but community support is extremely important. If we can educate not just families, but communities on that these things are happening, first of all, which is one of the big reasons I wrote this book, is let's draw attention. Let's hold up the red flag and say, hey, this is happening, and stop minimizing. Let's focus, instead of focusing on the negative behaviors, like, in Tiffany's story, the crying in the middle of the nurse is like, okay, what's happening here? She's trying to treat the tears and that in that moment. But let's get to why. Let's get to why is this child having constant outburst? Why is this child, and then understanding some of the more obvious things as far as, anger and um, the physiological signs of what's happening, because I think for a lot of children, especially when we go through these things with teachers, for me, I can look back and I can go, okay, these teachers are human. They made some mistakes, right? But telling me that I was being ridiculous, I wasn't being ridiculous. I was having emotions that I couldn't explain. I couldn't communicate. Getting more training. And then education is always going to be our first defense, normalizing and making therapy more readily available. How many people do we all know who could benefit from therapy but can't afford it? Even BetterHelp is expensive. Like you get these online therapies and Medicaid doesn't really cover, depending on what levels you have and what state you live in. Medicaid does not always cover mental health. And so if you live at or below the poverty line and you are trying to pull yourself up, how are you going to get this help? There's only so many churches. There's only so many people who volunteer their time. So we as a nation have a responsibility, if we want to stop this cycle and help people heal and create a better community, we need to allow for people to get the help they need. Antidepressants, understanding the effects antidepressants actually have on a brain, and that it's not just because somebody's on antidepressants doesn't make them crazy. It doesn't mean that there's anything else wrong other than they have a chemical imbalance. That's it. That's all it is we are balancing out the neurochemistry so that they can function normally for them.
I remember whenever I started, I had postpartum after I had Nora, and I had never been depressed in my entire life. I'd never had any of those symptoms or known anything about it. And I started just feeling like this overwhelming urge when I'd get mad to like kick things and punch things and just get ticked off at things that I knew were ridiculous. And I was like, what is wrong with me? And it took my boss saying to me, like, you seem a little angrier than normal. I'm like, oof. Your boss is saying, something to you like, why has my family not said anything? Number one, like they've had to have noticed.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, I wonder if I've got postpartum, even though it was 6 months after I'd had Nora. Well, of course, my, postpartum depression screening was off the charts. And I started on an antidepressant, and I had, some people with the old stigmas, you're going to mess up your brain. And it's like, guys,
we're fixing it.
We're in 2024 here.
Yeah. I like what you said about trying to make it more affordable because, relating it to pediatric cancer, there a good chunk of these families, number one, some of them start out already on the poverty line, but then if they're not, your child's diagnosed with cancer, oftentimes a parent has to leave work. So your income is often cut by 50% or more. And I really wish we could find a way to offer free therapy for families going through this. Really for anybody. But, a lot of times it's true. I hear that a lot from people, I'd love to go to therapy, but it costs me X amount for each appointment, even if they do have insurance. That is a tricky topic. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. And I think also we as a country could do better at paying people in the social work field. Because I know Maxine, my therapist, she was actually an LPSW or an LCSW. And so she was a licensed counsel social worker. And so she had her master's degree. She wasn't a PhD, but she is who I went to from the time I was in 6th grade all the way until my senior year of high school, till I graduated. And, but social work is not a field that somebody's going to make a lot of money in. And it's definitely not a field that people tend to stay in very long because it is emotionally draining.
Yep.
You're dealing with a lot.
Caseloads are huge too. They typically have so many families that they're trying to deal with because they're working with limited amount of staff.
Oh yeah.
Can you discuss any personal stories or case studies where interventions helped rewire a trauma-affected pathways of the brain?
Sorry, that was
I know, delving into the next question, I just dove right into it on you.
So as far as personal stories, so one of the things we kind of skipped was one of the common therapies that are used to treat PTSD. And so when we talk about therapies, the most used is CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy. And I did provide you guys with a link. I don't know if you want to share that so that listeners can go on and kind of look at that and stuff. But that was one of the biggest things that we did. But it focuses on relating behaviors and having those conversations with the negative reminders and trying to understand what's happening. And it can be done in a group setting. Mine was done individually. And so with that being said, I did set aside a part of my book to read for this part. My therapist was really good about, I mean, obviously therapists, that's their job. They get to know you, right? And how you think. And so one of the ways that we did things is we had phrases throughout different stages. And one of the problems that I really struggled with growing up was this sense of worthiness, because a lot of my trauma was caused by neglect and abuse at the hands of my parents. And so when a parent is abusing a child, that parent's the person that's supposed to love them more than anything, right? And telling them that they're worthless, they're stupid. I mean, if my mom thinks that, it must be true. And so even going through that and having at the point where Maxine and I were talking about these things, I had been going to therapy for quite a while. And I had worked through a lot, but I still really felt like I was just kind of faking it, having to prove myself in each room. And, did I like having to justify my existence? That I had to be the best. I had to be the loudest. I had to be the smartest. I had to be the most talented person in the room. Otherwise, I didn't deserve to exist. What's the point? And so we went through quite a few things, but I'm going to start reading. So this is from my book, Ketchup Sandwiches. And this is in the chapter called Fake It Till You Make It. And so this is page 243. Through it all, Maxine and I have been working on phrases I can use in my head when I start to feel like I am just faking it till I make it, as I have come to call it. Phrases to remind me that I deserve to exist and my life is not a mistake. Phrase 1. God does not make mistakes. I say this phrase when my brain flashes me to heated moments of my childhood, when my mother's voice is joined with the chorus of kids that made my life hell by pointing out every flaw. When something embarrassing happens, causing my brain to pull me into the torment of my childhood. Every dirty shirt, every time my pants were too tight or too big, every time I had to go to school having not showered in 3 days. It is in those moments that I repeat phrase 1 until my heart and my brain can come together and create calm. Phrase 2, you are enough. This phrase gives me comfort this summer when my heart is crushed. I know it's not fair to myself to play the comparison game. But all the therapy in the world isn't going to change the fact that I am human, and sometimes my brain just goes there. So even though I may not be as pretty as other girls, even though I am not as funny or talented, I am enough. My friendship with Brandon may be irrevocably changed, but my plainness and lack of shine, sorry guys, but I am enough. And sometimes I combine that phrase 2 with phrase 1 when I'm trying to find some solace. Phrase 3, no one can make you feel inferior without your permission. This is a quote from the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And it has been such a great tool. Approaching senior year, filling out college applications, and looking forward to the future have all been very daunting. Talking about my dreams to other people, especially peers, often yields looks of incredulity and what I perceive as uncertainty. Like they are hearing the little girl say that she wants to be a princess. It's a sweet sentiment, but an unrealistic goal. This phrase has given me confidence to forge ahead and ignore all the comments and perceptions of those around me. I and I alone determine my future. What a power-filled thought. Now that I talk about becoming a physical therapist or singing my songs without shame. And that alone is crazy. So these phrases, funnily enough, I do repeat them still because as confident and as much as I know I'm blessed in my life, there are still times when it's like we talked about, those grooves, those pathways in our brains, with those thought processes, they get the better of me. And even though I know I'm not that child anymore, I still have to repeat those phrases. God does not make mistakes. You are enough. And no one can make you feel inferior without your permission. And so having somebody come in and work these tools with me, she gave me a lot of therapy homework. I would take things home all the time and have to turn them back in, which I think also came to the fact that I was young and she wanted to make sure that I was actually doing the therapy. Maybe more adults are more accountable, but that's one of the tools that we use to rewire my brain.
I love that. So, what do you think are ways that families can prepare themselves to kind of help handle these potential setbacks or triggers during this recovery? I know you just mentioned several phrases, so maybe finding some phrases that they can use. What are some other ways that they can prepare?
I think the first thing you can do to prepare for a setback is expect the setback. It's going to happen. You're going to have times in your healing process. I wish I could tell you healing was linear, and once you have a breakthrough on something, you never struggle with it again. I'm sorry, you're going to. And for me, I know faith plays a big role in dealing with these setbacks too, and holding on. I know who my God is. I know what he's capable of. I know that he has this. And so that is a big comfort, but mistakes are going to happen. And when those bad days happen, forgive yourself, identify, openly talk about it. Don't just hold it in. My husband gets all of my, because Tiffany knows this about me, but sometimes I just talk my feelings out loud because I have to work it through. And I'm an auditory learner. And so I have to work it through. And so sometimes my husband's like looking at me like he knows that he's not actually there for me to talk to. He's just there and I'm talking. And and so working those feelings out loud, getting them out, saying, I felt XYZ. Here's how I handled it. That was not the way to handle it. And then with my kids, we all have bad moments as parents. We all have moments where we go, whew, that was totally inappropriate. And so apologizing to my kids, I've explained to my kids, I'm very open with my daughter, knows a lot more, about how I grew up and stuff. And she'll tell people all the time, my mom was in foster care. and I'm like, yes. And so people look at me and I'm like, well, I have to explain sometimes my reactions or my overprotectiveness, my unwillingness, like sleepovers. I can't do it. I cannot do a sleepover. And it was so common when we were growing up, to have sleepovers. And I can't. It puts this pit of fear in my stomach. And anytime that I'm like, no, I don't even say maybe anymore. I just say, I'm sorry, that's not, our family doesn't do sleepovers. So, explaining yourself, working through your feelings, expect the setbacks, and don't brush it under the rug. Don't sweep it by, because if that's how we build those pent up emotions, right? And then it becomes easier to get triggered when we're not acknowledging our feelings. And then you're going to have an explosion in the middle of Walmart and everybody's going to be looking at you like it's just a can of green beans. So
I'll tell you one thing. Kelly, so Kelly, Stephanie, when she came over and stayed with us, I think it was 2 summers. Was it 2 summers ago?
2 summers ago now, yeah.
Yeah. And so she told the kids, she said, y'all are going to get in there and go to bed, and you're not going to play. And if you play, Reagan's going to go to the other room, and y'all are going to go to bed. And Zane knows that I am a pushover. And he's going to test boundaries. And they were in the bed talking, and Stephanie walks up there and said, Reagan, go to your room. And Zane was like, like, what just happened here? So,
oh yeah, Well, and I'm a firm believer in my parenting style. If you say you're going to do something, you do it. Say what you mean what you say.
I'm working on that one. Yep. That can be tough sometimes,
mhm.
but I think you're right. It's important to follow through.
Well, and
Jane
not
knows I
even,
don't follow through.
yeah, not even just on the discipline side, but it's confusing. If mom said
Right.
she's going to, discipline me and she doesn't, then when mom says she's going to be there to pick me up at school, is she going to be there? Those kind of things. And then with rewards too, my kids they have those elephant memories, right? They never forget a reward. They forget the rules all the time, but they never forget a reward.
Absolutely. Mine just hit me up for money earlier because I told her earlier I'd give her $1 if she unloaded the dishwasher. We're working on chores. And I forgot. And it's been like 3 days. And she goes, "You never gave me that $1." And I was like, "You're right. I'm so sorry." I'm like scrounging for change because who has cash on them? I'm like, okay.
I know.
So absolutely.
Side note, when did Legos get so expensive? I don't remember them being that expensive when we were growing up, but that's like
Legos
their
are the
reward
worst.
right now is Legos or Switch games. And I'm just like,
it's a hefty
I don't
reward.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go down to those $5 that store, Five Below.
Yeah.
Five Below.
So Tiffany kind of touched on this earlier when we were talking about like how society views PTSD and antidepressants. And I do think personally that is changing, which I'm very happy about. People never talked about their emotions and their trauma out loud in the past. But what role does education about PTSD and trauma play in changing these societal perceptions? And what future research or developments are you most hopeful about in the field of trauma and healing?
So, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is proactive versus reactive. Obviously, we can't prevent a car accident. You can't prevent cancer from happening. You can't prevent these things from happening. However,
Don't
in
mind my
the
weather forecast.
in the in the scheme of like, say, for cancer especially, like you're going to be in the hospital a lot, we can do stuff on the front end to talk about what's about to happen and the trauma that it's about to incur. No matter how prepared you are, no matter what kind of medical background you have, if you or a loved one is fighting cancer, it's different. You are not the professional anymore. You're the patient. You're the patient's family. And you're going to experience the same things that every other patient's family experiences. And so I know you probably know it, but here's a list. And this is what we want you to be on the lookout for. These are ways you can support each other through this trauma. And these are things that you need to look for in recovery. I don't know how you have a cancer survivor. How many times when your daughter got sick post remission, did you go, it's back?
Oh, all the time.
Your brain's just there. It's back. We're about to go back. I had those moments growing up. I knew that I wasn't going to be forced to move back in with my mom at a certain point, but I still felt like if I made the wrong choice at my aunt and uncle's house, or if I got in enough trouble, they were going to kick me out. And so understanding and having that education, let's be proactive. As far as abuse and neglect goes, I would really like to see us do more in low income communities. I'd like to see us do more to get information out there. Obviously, we have to struggle with how do we do that? How do we do that without being condescending? How do we do that without forcing people to do programs that they don't have time to do? How do we get this information into their hands? So it's a conversation that I want to continue to have and stuff. And then I think we're doing a lot with therapies. And like you said, it is becoming more common. And I think as people talk about their traumas, I think the best thing we can do as a society moving forward is let's not just focus on the trauma. Let's focus on the healing. Let's focus on the hope. We don't have to live in it. Let's acknowledge it and let's keep healing. Because I think what I see a lot, like on TikTok and other places, people share their stories all the time, but they're not sharing the positivity. They're not sharing the other side of it, that you can heal. You can have a parent who abuses you and then grow up to be a good parent. You can have these negative experiences and get through the pain. It's going to affect you. You're going to have it forever, but it doesn't have to define you. And so let's talk about the hope and the healing and how do we heal? Let's keep talking about the therapy and the antidepressants and that it's okay to get help. It's okay to ask for help. So as far as treatment wise, CBT still is the standard. And then getting people in to do more MRIs, getting more studies done to understand the brain's an ever changing thing. I don't know. I watch a lot of YouTube neurologists talk a lot because I don't know, I'm weird and I like the science side of that. But they learn something new all the time about how our brains are growing and how these hormones affect our brains. It's insane. And then foods, and there's a whole like other subcategory that we could go into as far as the preservatives and things that we're eating that are also affecting our brains and how we deal with trauma. But that's a whole other like podcast. So
That's a whole other podcast that we could probably have you on.
Right. Well, so I'm like sitting here listening to this. And I'm like, oh, so Kelly helped develop, along with some other people that she elicited, for a basic A to Z guide for pediatric cancer families. And now I'm like, okay, well, now we need a chapter on mental health added to this book. And Stephanie is going to help us write it. I'm going to help write a chapter on grief. And then Stephanie is going to help us write a chapter on PTSD, because I think that any cancer family develops some form of PTSD, even if it's super mild. But
absolutely. Last
I was
year,
like,
I had
ooh.
a mental health nurse a friend of mine who's a mental health nurse who wrote she wrote a couple pages about breathing techniques and coping strategies. But I absolutely want to elaborate on that more. So you'll probably be hearing from me, Stephanie, because your story is just incredible. And
we didn't talk about it, but grounding was something else that my therapist, we did a lot. And the PTSD flashbacks were really intense. So I know I was assaulted by my stepfather for about a year. And so that's one of the things that I struggled with was the physical touch and stuff. And then I would have triggers where I would have those severe, like you see it on TV, those severe physiological PTSD symptoms. My heart rate would go up and I couldn't breathe. And I would get shaky and like everything would get a little blurry at the edges. And so grounding, we worked on that, 5 things that you can see, 5 things you can feel, 5 things you can taste or touch or smell, and then repeat and repeat until you go, okay, I am here. I'm in this place. I'm not back where I was. And for anybody who's having, like you said, your hands were shaking when you walked in for your daughter's scan, that's a physiological symptom of your PTSD, of a psychological problem. And so, sorry, hit the mic.
No, that's beautiful. Now, I have this question, and if you want to answer it with no, too bad, you have to read the book first to find out, but why Ketchup Sandwiches, number one? And then my second part to that is, where can people purchase your book? Because I already am ready to read it. So can you tell us? You don't have to. If you don't want to give away why the title, that's fine. I'll tell people you have to read it. But
well, the actual story behind the title, you can only fit so many stories into the book, and the book is 327 pages long. So, but the actual story, it came from a TikTok that I did long time ago. And it was a story. So Ketchup Sandwiches is a story that I tell when I explain to people, we all have moments in our childhood where we start to realize the differences between families. And for me, I'm at school one day talking to a friend. It had been a rough weekend. We didn't go to church that Sunday with my grandmother. And so that meant we didn't do Sunday lunch. So the last time I had really eaten was Friday at school. And so here it is on a Monday, and I'm hungry. And I really only went to school that day because I was hungry. And talking to one of my friends, and she was talking about this birthday party she went to, and she would not stop talking about the cake. And I'm just sitting there going, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry. And so then the conversation turns to me. And she's like, well, what did you do this weekend? Didn't do much. Hung out with my sisters. My mom was gone most of the weekend, so it was just me and my sisters, and we didn't have any food. We had bread, we had ketchup. And I was like, well, not much. My sisters and I kind of just made ketchup sandwiches last night and waited till school got here today. And immediately she looked at me and was like, you did what? And so it was one of those moments socially as a kid where I was like, oh crap, I said something wrong. And so I'm trying to like dial it in, redirect. And I was like, like when you don't have a lot of food, but you have bread and you have ketchup. And obviously she's looking at me with her little 10-year-old eyes going, no, I don't know that because my house is never without food. And that was one of those moments where I realized, hey, my family really isn't like everyone else's. Most people don't go through what I'm going through. And so I do there is a scene in the book where I am making ketchup sandwiches. But that is the story behind it because I feel like it encompasses the neglect and abuse side of things and what we went through. Also, it's really catchy. And people ask me that question all the time. And that's what I want. I want people to go, what is this? And then let's talk about neglect and abuse. And the second part is you can find it on Amazon. And I can send you guys the link if you guys want to post it as well and stuff. But right now it's on Amazon. I'm pushing it out, hopefully to Barnes and Noble soon. And we'll see what happens. It's all about exposure right now. And I tell people all the time, I'm struggling praying about it. I'm struggling with comfortability because I am a mom. I am a military spouse. And so my career and aspirations, while important, the military still comes first. And I have 2 young children to consider. And so it's not like I can just up and go places right now because my husband has to be able to up and go. So we can't both do that. And so right now I'm kind of sticking with more podcast tours and online presence rather than doing in-person stuff.
Well, I'm excited. I'm absolutely going on Amazon to purchase it. And Tiffany and I will list it in our link to this podcast, and also all the resources that you talked about, like the CBT therapy and whatnot, will also be linked to this podcast as well.
Awesome.
So if you can leave our listeners with one final thought, what would that be?
Hope and healing is possible. Like, let's cling tight to it, move through it. And I promise on the other side, you're going to have happiness.
I love it.
Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. Your story is incredible. Like I said, I absolutely want to go read that book. And I have a feeling of listeners, because you gave us just a couple snippets here and there throughout the podcast. And I appreciate you being able to relate what you went through, which is obviously very different. But you're able to still relate that and the trauma and how it affects the brain and the resources and the tools that people can utilize to pediatric cancer families and patients. So we really appreciate having you on here. So thank you for joining us, being a part of conversation. And if anyone listening needs support in navigating their pediatric cancer journey or wishes to be a guest on our podcast, please let us know.
You can also get involved with the National Pediatric Cancer Foundation through fundraising, volunteering, promoting awareness, or contributing to pediatric cancer research. Just leave a comment or reach out to us via the contact links in the description. Until next time, keep fighting the unexpected fight.